All right, let's just dive right into this. Today, we've got a truly fascinating explainer queued up for you. We're going to impartially unpack a highly controversial and honestly super unconventional essay. This source material constructs a deeply fringe hypothesis that basically attempts to link high-functioning autism, specifically conditions like Asperger syndrome, to literal ancient biblical entities. Now, whether you're well-versed in ancient theology, psychology, or you're just kind of interested in how fringe theories get built from the ground up, we're going to look strictly at how the author of this text constructs their argument. We are absolutely not endorsing these views, but rather we're examining the fascinating, if definitely controversial way this essay tries to connect modern neurodevelopmental conditions with ancient myths. So, here's our roadmap for the author's argument. First, a controversial genetic hypothesis. Second, the Nephilim connection. Third, the serpent seed lineage. Fourth, idolatry and biblical behaviors. And finally, a nefarious spiritual disguise.
Okay, Section 1, a controversial genetic hypothesis. Let's look at the very foundation of the author's entire premise. The source kicks things off by asking us to consider a pretty radical proposition. What if high-functioning autism is actually an ancient spiritual genetic lineage? The text suggests that what modern medicine lumps together and labels as autism isn't just a single monolithic condition. Instead, they propose it's a patchwork of completely different origins. Now, for some, they totally concede it might just be environmental or medical, but for others, well, the proposition is much more esoteric. They're suggesting that for a specific, highly functional subset, the condition is literally an intrinsic part of their spiritual and genetic identity.
And this brings us to a core concept that we really need to define for the rest of this explainer: ancient genetic remnants. This is the overarching theory put forward by the source. They claim that modern, high-functioning autistic individuals actually carry the diluted DNA of biblical entities. Specifically, they're pointing to the Nephilim and the serpent seed. It is a really striking blend of pseudo-archaeology, theology, and genetics all rolled into one. Moving on to Section 2, the Nephilim connection. So, how does the author actually try to prove this ancient bloodline theory? Well, they point straight to physical evidence, specifically the famous elongated skulls found in Paracas, Peru. Discovered way back in 1928, these 3,000-year-old remains are claimed to be up to 25% larger than normal human skulls. To put that into perspective, that is a massive difference in cranial capacity. The text stresses that these anomalies, like having different cranial plates and unusually large eye sockets, are absolutely not the result of artificial head binding, which was common back then, but are entirely genetic. Plus, the source cites DNA testing that supposedly suggests European and Middle Eastern origins. The essay then takes this physical profile and theorizes that these elongated cranial structures would create totally different brain development patterns, specifically affecting social cognition and sensory processing, precisely the areas impacted by autism. To really hammer home how extreme these claims are, the text points to the discovery of red hair on some of these South American remains. They believe this completely defies conventional human migration patterns. Quoting researchers who studied these hair samples, the essay boldly claims these beings are not human. Or at least they are not fully human. The source uses this quote to assert that this bizarre combination of anomalous DNA, elongated skulls, and red hair creates a highly distinctive profile that still manifests today, albeit in a diluted form, in certain autistic individuals. Then, things take an even wilder turn as the essay connects this physical evidence to behavioral traits using the Book of Enoch. They sequence this fascinating, if highly unorthodox, logical chain. First, they claim fallen angels, specifically naming figures like Azazel and Barakijal, introduced hidden knowledge to humanity. We're talking crafts like metallurgy and astrology. Then they propose this knowledge wasn't just taught in a classroom, it was actually passed down genetically. Finally, they argue that this celestial inheritance manifests today as the exceptional technical, mathematical, and engineering aptitudes we often observe in high-functioning autistic individuals. According to the source, that intense specialized focus isn't just a quirk, it's quite literally a fallen angelic trait. But the text doesn't just stop at technical aptitude. Actually, here is where they venture into highly controversial moral territory. The essay makes a sweeping generalization, attempting to link seemingly unmotivated or senseless crimes committed by autistic individuals to the gratuitous violence of the biblical Nephilim described in Genesis 6. The theory basically frames these tragic modern events as evidence of inherently violent ancient genetics at play, genetics that they claim are predisposed toward gratuitous harm.
Section 3, the serpent seed lineage. Having established their view on the Nephilim, The author then argues for a second, completely distinct mythological lineage, this one tracing all the way back to the Garden of Eden. The source theorizes that within autism there are actually distinct physical subsets. On one hand, you have the Nephilim lineage, which they associate with larger stature and shorter faces, but contrasting this is the serpent seed lineage, linked to a smaller stature and long, narrow faces. The author posits that the serpent in Eden literally inserted genetic material into Eve, which resulted in Cain. So both of these lineages result in social awkwardness according to the text, but they stem from entirely different ancient origins. It's like a giant genetic puzzle they're trying to piece together using mythology. The essay even digs into the historical archives of Hans Asperger himself, the researcher who first identified Asperger syndrome. Asperger famously noted that these children often possessed what he called angelic faces. Now, rather than just seeing this as a simple, descriptive observation by a doctor, the text interprets this completely literally. They argue that this superficial beauty is exactly what one would expect to mask a fallen, ancient origin. Section 4. Idolatry and Biblical Behaviors. Now let's look at how the author takes modern psychology and just superimposes it right over biblical concepts. A defining diagnostic characteristic of autism is often a tendency to prioritize objects or systems over people. The source equates this directly to the biblical sin of idolatry, literally placing non-living things above the living. The text asserts that the intense engineering and artistic skills found in these individuals are historically linked to the creation of idols. They theorize that these specific skill sets were historically necessary to devise elaborate illusions and mechanisms that made ancient idols seem alive. So, they're essentially turning a neurodevelopmental trait into a spiritual transgression. The essay then looks to the New Testament to really try and cement this point, specifically pointing to Jesus' interactions with the Pharisees. When Jesus called them a brood of vipers, or sons of your father the devil, the text insists that these were absolutely not metaphors. Nope. The essay claims Jesus was speaking literally about the Pharisees' genetic heritage, identifying them directly as carriers of the serpent seed DNA. To back this up, the author literally takes the biblical actions of the Pharisees and matches them point for point with modern diagnostic criteria for autism. For instance, their strict adherence to Mosaic law is framed as a fixation with rules and hyper-literal interpretation. The biblical description of their hardness of heart is mapped directly to a lack of empathy. Their refusal to heal on the Sabbath, well, that's cited as extreme cognitive rigidity. Finally, their inability to grasp Jesus' parables is blamed on an autistic literal-mindedness. It's a highly specific, retroactive diagnosis uniquely tailored to support their overarching thesis. Section 5. A nefarious spiritual disguise. Before making their final grand claim, the author draws a hard line in the sand, separating the autism spectrum into two very distinct camps. High-functioning autism, specifically Asperger's in highly verbal individuals, is classified as an inherent spiritual nature masking ancient Nephilim or serpent seed DNA. This is something they say you are born with, your true nature. Conversely, they view low-functioning autism as a genuine medical condition, one with external causes that can just activate suddenly. The controversial theory we've been examining applies strictly to the high-functioning subset. Which brings us to the source's stark, ultimate conclusion. They state that what is particularly nefarious about this whole phenomenon is how it has been disguised as a mere medical condition. In the text's view, society is completely ignoring a literal demonic presence, or the remnants of ancient giants hiding right in plain sight. They argue that labeling these individuals as autistic completely obscures their true spiritual nature, preventing society from recognizing what the author perceives as a very real, very ancient spiritual threat. So, what does this all mean for us? The text essentially suggests that conditions we firmly label as medical might require spiritual solutions rather than physical ones. Regardless of how extreme or controversial these claims are, and they are definitely both, it forces us to ask a really compelling question. If fringe theories like this actively seek spiritual solutions for established medical conditions, what does that mean for our broader understanding of human diversity? How on earth do we balance the lines between ancient mythology, deeply held spiritual beliefs, and modern psychological science? It's a fascinating look into how unorthodox arguments are constructed, and it's certainly something to chew on. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and hey, always keep questioning what you read.